Hey, this is Leslie with Distill Me This, and today's video I am all about the rums. We are back with Brad and the Rum School, and today it's all about rums, rum production, the history of rums, and if you're beginning in rums, this is a video for you. We're going to talk all the areas and what kind of cocktails might be good with different rums, and I'm looking forward to this, so let's go. Hey, this is Leslie with Distill Me This, and I am here at Cork Cask, which is an amazing bar, which we will show you later. And I'm with Brad again. We're having drinks with Brad, but today we're learning about rum. So let's get to it.
All right.
Yeah. So how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good.
Have you been drinking plenty of vermouth since our last time together?
Yes, I have. I have. If you haven't seen our last video, we did vermouth from Del Professor, and really wonderful aperitivos and amaros that you should definitely check out. So yes, I have been. It's been wonderful. Yeah. Let's move on to rum, which I'm really actually kind of interested in. I'm not as educated in rum as I am in some other spirits. So one of my questions would be, okay, rum. What is rum?
Yeah.
How about let's go with that?
Yeah, what is rum? Rum is just simply any spirit made exclusively from sugarcane.
Okay.
That's basically simply it. Now there's a couple different ways that you can look at it. There's two we're going to talk a lot about different styles of classification because that's probably the most confusing part about the rum world today. But really you can look at rum as coming from one of two different directions. It can either come from directly from sugarcane, which is, a juice. It's essentially more of a vegetable than it is a sugar is what we think of, right?
Okay.
So you think of cane, you think of the plant.
Right, I do.
So it can come directly from that cane plant, or it can come from the cane byproduct, which would be, usually molasses. Occasionally you get a rum from processed sugar, from white sugar or something like that. That's very rare and typically looked down upon in a lot of different ways. Not to say they're bad, but most rum producers aren't going to be looking for that kind of stuff. But so pretty much we're going to be looking today from cane juices or molasses. Those are the two kind of styles.
Okay.
But that's rum. Now, there's a lot of confusion around the rum world. There's a lot of confusion that a lot of people will say that rum is, the wild, wild west of the spirits world. Like there's no laws, there's no rules. That's not true.
Oh, really?
There are rules. There actually is a decent amount of structure to the rum world. But a lot of people break those structures. It's not as firm. It's not like bourbon where it has to be new charred oak made from corn, blah, 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 blah. It's not like cognac. It has to be from a specific part of France.
Okay.
But there are rules, there are regulations, and we will hopefully talk about that some today.
Okay. Do some places use the sugar? I mean, some lower end companies, like, I'm trying to think of...
the white sugar?
Yeah.
Let's just not even talk about that. There are a couple that use just white sugar, packet sugar almost, or simple syrup.
Would those be kind of like bottom shelf type, or not even?
You're not going to see those on the market.
Oh, okay.
First and foremost, if you do, you should be raising your eyebrow to it. Like, what is going on here? Why would they even go down that path? I guess. So, yeah, just ignore those altogether. We're going to focus in on the cane juice and the molasses for sure.
All right, so let's dive in.
Yeah.
He's brought some rums in different places. So how do you want to do this? Do you want to do this
let's talk about where rum came from to start, right? So, rum is kind of integral to the history of distilled spirits. It really is the history of distilled spirits. When you think, what is distilled spirits? It's something that is distilled or stripped away from a fermented beverage. And what is a fermented beverage? It's simply something that where sugar comes in contact with active yeast. The yeast eats the sugar, and the yeast spits out carbon dioxide and alcohol. And that's what we're drinking when we're drinking beer, wine, or any other fermented, even kombucha, or any other fermented beverage. That's what we're drinking. That's what alcohol is. So, and what's the easiest thing to produce sugar? Sugar cane.
Sugar cane.
Of course, right?
Yeah.
So as long as there's been sugar cane, there's been at least rum's fermented cousin, which has a few different names, but rum bouillon is what it's kind of been known as in the Caribbean.
Okay.
Don't really see rum bouillon. My understanding, I haven't had it. My understanding, it's not very tasty. You gotta kind of steer away from it.
Okay.
But that's kind of the start. Now,
Okay.
how far back does rum go?
That's a good question. I have no idea.
The history of distillation in the Western world dates back to about the earliest known period of distillation for beverage is 1484 in England.
Oh.
However, we know that the Arabians and potentially the Moors in Spain were distilling some 300, 400, 500 years before that, but strictly for religious purposes, not to consume, but to actually they're seeking out the spirit of life. Al-Kul, meaning spirit of life in Arabian. Or you can look at the term ushkabe, which was the term that whiskey came from, which means water of life. Aquavite, aquavit, any of those are all just derivatives, all just from the same root, meaning water or spirit of life, depending on which way you come from. So anyways, we know that people were distilling into liquids in the 800, 900 AD time period. But we also know from digging that much deeper beyond Western society, going to China and Southeast Asia, there was distillation happening for perfumes, essential oils, and whatnot, going back 1,000 years before the birth of Christ, that time frame. So the first distillation for beverage, likely, we don't have any true evidence of this, but if you follow the rabbit hole, if you will, probably dating back to around 0 AD or so, or maybe shortly before, shortly after, in Indonesia and Southeast Asia. That spirit was called Batavian Iraq, or it was called Iraq when the Dutch made it there. The Dutch made it to Indonesia, landed at the port they named Batavia after the Batavian Kingdom, and created a beverage called Batavian Iraq. So I brought an example here. This is not an ancient example of it. This is actually a very modern example of it from a distillery in Amsterdam, but Batavian Iraq. That's kind of what the start of it was.
That's awesome.
Then you fast forward about 1,000 years or 1,500 years, or give or take, or nobody really knows how far you fast forward, but then you get to the 1500s, about shortly after the arrival of the Europeans with Christopher Columbus and other explorers into the Caribbean world, and you get the planting of sugarcane in the Caribbean, in Central America, and in South America, and of course with the planting of sugarcane, it creates the necessary development into fermented beverage, as happens in every culture. And then once you have a fermented beverage and you know how to distill, which we know they did based on whiskey and cognac production from before that, they went ahead and start distilling as early as 1520, 1540 or so in that area. Now, what was distilled first? Barbados thinks they were distilling first, which may have been true. There's definitely a story that goes along with that, but I think more likely in the areas of the rainforests and more coastal areas of Brazil, the slaves in that area were actually making a very raw, very rough version of rum, basically just single pot still distilled sugarcane spirit, which now is known as cachaça.
Which I love.
Brought a little example of
Excellent.
cachaça as well. Cachaça now, by law, is always made from just sugar cane, and it's always pot still. Actually, they use like a very rudimentary chamber still. It's almost like a pot still, almost like a column still.
Really?
Yeah, so it's very rudimentary. It's very simple, but
Basic.
it gives you that raw essence of sugar cane, grassy elements, slightly sweet. You might get a little vanilla. You get a lot of like tropical fruits out of cachaça. That's the start to rum. Then by the time Barbados was in full gear, certainly by the mid-1500s, you had, the Mount Gay distillery is, the oldest, kind of enterprise distillery in the Caribbean. They've been making rum for 500 plus years. You also have the Port Morant in Guyana, making rum possibly a little bit older, possibly a little bit younger, but it's within a few decades of the time the Mount Gay started as well. Ever since then, you've got rum.
Wow. Okay. There's your history lesson.
Yeah.
So what's the difference between, let's say, to the beginner of rum, what's the difference between a white rum, a aged rum, a spiced rum?
Yeah. So there's a few different ways of looking at rum. There's that way, which is basically built on, decades of simple marketing.
Okay.
It's usually one or two brands that just want to have a bunch of different labels in front
Sure.
of you. And you get different styles based on those different things.
Okay.
So the terms that maybe you're used to hearing, especially if you're looking at the middle or bottom shelves on the rum category, you're used to hearing silver, you're used to hearing gold, you might hear añejo, you might hear aged, anything like that, and then you hear the term spiced. I'm going to go ahead and just kind of capsulize spice real quick.
Okay, let's
Spice is just simply a rum that you're adding spice to, that you're flavoring with spices.
Okay.
If that category was put into the U.S. first, instead of the U.S. adopting kind of Caribbean traditions, that category would probably be called a liqueur instead of truly
Okay.
a rum, because there's not really any other category. Think of like flavored whiskeys.
Sure.
Well, they have to be called flavored. You can't just have a peanut butter whiskey. You can't have a peanut butter bourbon, right? You have a bourbon flavored with peanut butter.
Right.
Something like that. That's kind of where the term spiced rum would go if it was classified today. However, it's kind of grandfathered in over the last 150 years or so,
Sure.
where simply you're just taking rum and you're adding cinnamon, clove, vanilla, oranges, sugar, whatever you want to add in to create the flavor. And there's some really kind of crazy one. There's no rules. It doesn't have to be vanilla and clove in one.
Oh, it doesn't?
No, it could
Oh,
be.
it could be any
anything.
spice of
Yeah.
spices that you want to
Right.
put in, just like any
Right.
other spiced
Spiced anything.
anything.
Right.
Okay.
Exactly.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so that's what spiced rum is. And you
Okay.
can use white rum, you can use dark rum, you can use a black rum, anything like that. That's all spiced if you're adding those kind of flavoring additives. If it's
Fabulous.
not going to be a spiced rum, or if it's not going to be flavored rum, then it's got to be essentially pure rum. Now, they are allowed a certain percentage of additives, which is where the rum world gets really hazy, if you will. So if you look at gold rum, typically your bottom shelf gold rum is simply a white rum or a very lightly aged rum where you're adding color. Now the color normally comes from caramel coloring. They use a specific coloring called E150. That's the grade of caramel coloring that they're using typically, and they can use other grade. There's no rules on that, but you use that coloring to add the color to the rum. There's very little flavor impact.
Okay.
But they
It's just
might
the color.
exactly. There might be a little touch of sweetness from the coloring because it is caramel, but it's typically very, very little, if any.
Okay.
And they might throw it in a barrel, and they might let it sit in a barrel for a little bit, but there's no requirements on that for a gold rum.
So, like an example of a gold rum
Sure.
would be.
Well,
like
the most
people
well
that
known is
most well-
Bacardi, right?
Bacardi.
So Bacardi, typically, if you look at the big, 175 liter containers of Bacardi, you're looking at silver and you're looking at gold. Sure, it's the same thing in the tequila world, right?
Right.
So Jose Cuervo,
Jose
you've got
Cuervo.
your silver, you've got your gold, right? So that's typically where, if you're seeing a gold rum, that's what you're looking at.
Okay.
It's actually the same thing if you're looking at typically your dark rums or your black rums. It's just the different grades of caramel coloring and the different amounts that you're adding in to that rum.
Got it.
So, if you want to kind of step from beyond the just very simple surface level rum categorizations, you start to look in those color descriptions. Don't tell you much about the rum at all.
Okay.
So, you do get different flavor. Of course, your cocktail presentation or things like that are going to be skewed by those different colors. But really, if you're looking to really hash out the different flavors of every rum, you don't want to look at the color designation on the label.
Got it.
Okay?
Okay.
Instead, this is where it gets hazy. This is where it's fuzzy, because there's not really a true classification system. There's no labeling requirement that's going to tell you enough about that rum to know what you're getting into. So I want to try to give you a couple tips and tools. So if you're selecting a new rum off of the shelf, if you're trying to decide which rum to use in a different cocktail, I want you to look for a couple key things on the label that hopefully are going to give you enough information to be able to select that rum.
So great. Do you want to do that now?
I guess so. Let's
Let's
do
do
it.
some little tips and tricks on how to up your level on rum.
So as we look at, I'm going to kind of look at kind of three specific kind of rums here, if you will. Oh, that's a bad example. This is a good example. So when we look at these three rums, and obviously I've been drinking some of them because, you know, what else are you going to do if you have rum? What you're looking at is three rums from three different regions, three different countries. There is a school of thought that you can classify rums kind of strictly in three different ways.
Okay.
It's kind of an outdated school of thought, and it's kind of looked at being kind of diminutive at this point, where it's not really telling you the full story. But you can look at Spanish style, British style, and French style. And the idea is whichever one of those three countries was colonizing it at least enough to install their language on those Caribbean countries, then the rum styles are going to follow certain patterns along that way.
Okay.
You can look at that. Typically your Spanish style is more floral, more lighter, more kind of linear kind of flavors.
Okay.
Your British style is more heavier, more fruit driven, more kind of punchy. And your Martinique or your French style, which actually does have some classifications we can talk about in a sec, is sugarcane, is very green, it's very grassy, it's very funky in a different way, if you will.
All right.
So you can look at things that way. I still do think they're a little bit diminutive. I don't think they're telling you enough. So I think you kind of start to look for different styles within different regions. What's great about rum is, as of now, it's really not cost prohibitive in any sense. You know, if you're going to spend $40 on a bourbon, you're going to get a comparable rum for 25 to 30,
Wow.
if that.
Wow.
Now that's not going to last long. The rum world is blowing up, so your prices are going to start skyrocketing pretty soon, as especially certain, you know, highly sought after rum, just like in the bourbon world, start to gain in popularity.
Mm-hmm.
So
All right.
brace yourself for that, but you're on the ground floor right now. You can go ahead and get in and get some cool
Get some
rums.
good quality rum.
But kind of the main kind of places that have the distinctive styles. We'll talk about 4 different countries that have distinctive styles. I have 3 of them in front of me, and I have, actually, here's a 4th right here. We talked about Barbados as being kind of the home to rum, the start of the rum. What's the right word? The rum tradition. It's the start,
Yeah.
right? It's where they founded kind of rum as we know it from molasses. Looking at Barbados, there's 4 distilleries on Barbados that are active in rum production, 3 of which that you'll see regularly in most stores that carry a decent rum selection now today. Mountain Gay we talked about. The plantation lineup, the Barbados 5 years, of course, from Barbados, but that's from the West Indies Rum Distillers Company, which Plantation owns. And then you see Foursquare. And you see multiple different labels from the Foursquare, and Foursquare is probably at this point the most highly sought after rum, particularly among bourbon aficionados, because it has a lot of the same characteristics as bourbon. High proof, very oak focused, very intense, and lots of flavors coming out.
A lot of complexities.
Yeah, and Foursquare also makes Dorleys. They make the RL Seal label. They make the Probitas white rum label, as well as the Veritas white rum label. So you get a pretty wide, Real McCoy's made there as well. You get a pretty wide variety. Foursquare is kind of known for being the unadulterated rum. They're very, very passionate about not touching their rum.
Nice.
Yeah, and then, so you can move from Barbados. I think the easiest transition from Barbados is going to Guyana.
Okay.
There's several different areas, but I think Guyana stands out. You look right at the name of the distillers, and Guyana, there's only one distillery. It's called the Diamond Distillers Limited, and it is it's in Spanish and not in my English, but it's the Diamond Distillery, and they make all the rums from Guyana. So I have Lemon Heart, which is probably the most well-known rum from the Diamond Distillers from Guyana. There's also Boosers is from there. We have an example from Hamilton, which is a rum collector that has been bottling some really fine examples of rums.
Perfect.
And a few other varieties. El Dorado is from Guyana as well. So typically there you're going to get a smoky, rich, dark rum that's very indicative of, when you hear Demerara, you're thinking Demerara sugar.
Mm-hmm.
It's very indicative of that style.
All right.
Then you get Jamaica. Jamaica is probably the most well-known rum place because they're so passionate about their rum culture. The thing with Jamaican rums is I think there's 12 distilleries, I might be wrong on that, there's multiple distilleries on there that all have their own kind of house style. It's almost like going to Scotland. It's almost like going to Islay and tasting different whiskeys from Islay in Scotland, where
Wow.
there's 9 distilleries on Islay, but each one of those 9 distilleries has its own distinctive style. That's a little bit different than the other ones. They all have a common theme. In Islay, you have the peated whiskeys, kind of
Right.
all of them have some peat, except for a couple rare exceptions. Jamaica, except for a couple rare exceptions, all have what the Jamaicans call hogo. Hogo is actually a Jamaican derivative of the French term ogout, which means high taste.
Oh. So hogo
Hogo.
translates to ogut.
Ogout.
Okay.
High taste.
High taste.
Which actually, when you're tasting it, almost tastes like the exact opposite of high taste. Instead of being like rich and elegant, it's actually
Sure.
very musty and funky and like overripe bananas with like pungent humidity. Think of that like being in like, if you're in the Caribbean, it's 100 degrees and
Sure.
it's gross and it's sweaty and it's maritime and it's and there's seafood and there's plantains and all
Yeah.
that different stuff. That's the flavor
That's the
that you
flavor?
get
Really?
coming out of most Jamaica rums.
Wow.
Now, the most famous Jamaican rums is probably Appleton.
Okay.
Probably heard of Appleton. Appleton doesn't have that so much. They use far less of that estery. They call it esters. There, it has far less of that estery funk.
Okay.
Whereas if you go the opposite end, there's a very hot rum on the market right now called Hampton. Beautiful, beautiful high ester rum. And there's a few different selections you can go from there. The one we've got in front of us, again, bottled by Plantation, it's Long Pond and Clarendon blended together. Long Pond has higher ester, Clarendon a little bit less, so it's got a nice balance to it.
Okay.
Okay? And then if you go to Martinique, which has kind of become a forgotten tradition in the U.S. rum market, which is really too bad because their rums are absolutely phenomenal. This one that we have in front of us, the Neisson, is kind of the limousine of Martinique rums. It's the Cadillac. It's the creme de la creme, if you will.
So why is that? What
Yeah.
what makes it such
Yeah.
a creme de la creme?
Yeah, well, talking about Martinique, to begin with, Martinique is the only 100% tightly regulated GI, or geographic indicator, in the rum world. Now, Jamaica has a GI in process. Barbados has a GI in progress, but those aren't solidified yet. Martinique has it, and it's controlled by France. So it's actually an AOC, an Appellation.
Okay.
My French is terrible. Appellation Origin of Control.
Okay.
Is how it's translated. That means that the French government, who still controls Martinique, controls every aspect of production of Martinique agricole.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Similar to how they control Cognac or Armagnac.
Mhm.
Or if you go to the wine world, similar to how they control Bordeaux.
So anything from seed to bottle is really
there's
is
a very
really monitored,
controlled process.
so
right?
they know that the quality is there.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that's why you have a GI, so that
Okay.
you know that the quality of the rum in the bottle stands up to the name that you're putting on the bottle.
Okay.
The territory specifically.
Excellent.
Yeah. So
All right.
that's kind of that's the way to kind of start, in my opinion, looking at rums.
Okay.
And then from there you can start breaking down. If you look at a white rum like this from Hamilton, crystal clear rum, the thing to know, most of your white rums that are of any kind of quality actually are aged. So the color does come from the oak in most of your rums. Of course,
Okay.
like we said, there's some of that caramel coloring added.
Mm-hmm.
But what happens in the rum world is they actually allow their rum to age, and then they filter the color out.
Oh, kind of like they do with tequila, they kind of filter out reposado.
If
they
you're
might
looking at
filter out
the Cristalino,
Cristalino, yeah.
is the term in the tequila market that they actually just recently took from the rum world.
Oh, did they really?
Because up
Oh,
until
didn't know
maybe 15, 20 years ago, there really
Okay.
wasn't a market for Cristalino tequilas.
No.
You look at an extra añejo and it'd be dark, it'd be barrel aged, it'd have that dark color. Well, then they said, well, look at what the rum market's doing. They're taking their
Interesting.
5-year-old, 10-year-old rums and stripping the color, and with the color, you're stripping some of those oak tannins. So some of that bite that comes with the oak, you're stripping that out, and so you've softened the rum with age and oxidation and with some of those barrel flavors. You're adding some of those tannins that give some of that bite and that grip, and then you're stripping that back out. It's very, very smooth, typically mildly sweet floral rum coming out on the other side.
Fabulous.
And even Bacardi actually just kind of started that.
Okay.
Bacardi was the first one to kind of really concentrate on aging the rums, but then they started saying, "Well, all right, great, we did that. Now let's just shoot the rum straight to distill
And take
pull it
that
essentially
color
straight
up. Okay.
Yeah. So that's kind of what you're looking at with the color. So if you look at these two rums, they're actually not aged that far apart, but you see they're totally opposite
Very
in
different.
color, right? Again, this one from Guyana has some of that caramel coloring added back in to give it the color that you expect.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fabulous. Okay, so we've talked about like four different types, right?
Absolutely.
4 different areas, and kind of how to kind of leveling up from your. Nothing wrong with Bacardi, but something if you wanted
Bacardi's
to
a fantastic.
wanted to kind of bring yourself up and try something new.
Mhm.
So are these or the ones that you have over here for mixing only, or are they sipping, or a little bit of both?
Yeah, I don't like to differentiate.
Okay.
Particularly in the rum world, where rum, unlike where bourbon has become something that I think most bourbon aficionados feel like there's a split between, okay, this is a whiskey I'm going to
That's
put
a
in
sipper,
in a
that's a
cocktail,
mixer,
this
right.
is a whiskey I'm going to sip neat. And I think that kind of almost comes from the Scotch world to begin with.
Sure.
You think, okay, well, you've got your blends that you're going to throw in a cocktail or throw with ginger or soda or whatever. And then you've got your single malts, which you're going to sip neat, or maybe with a couple drops of water.
Sure.
The rum world never really embraced that kind of idea.
Right.
The rum world has always kind of looked at it like, well, rum is rum, and you're going to drink it. So how are you going to drink it? Are you going to drink it in a punch? Or are you going to drink
Sure.
it in a tropical cocktail or a tiki cocktail? Or are you going to drink it in an old-fashioned cocktail, like whether it's like an old-fashioned or a Manhattan or even like a rum and tonic or anything like that. All rums kind of fit where you can mix them in that way.
Okay.
If you can't sip on a rum, I don't think it's even worth having, in my opinion. I think that is where I start with the rum world.
Okay.
Now, that doesn't mean that every consumer that's watching this video, every person that's watching this video is going to pick up any bottle of rum and drink it and say, oh, that's good.
Delightful.
You're still going to develop your palate to that point.
Sure.
But I think just starting off with the mindset of, okay, whatever rum I pick up, whether it's $10 or $100, whether it's 25 years old or whether it's 2 years old, doesn't matter. I can make a cocktail with it. I can use it in my Mai Tai, or I can sip it right out of the glass.
So my mother, this is what she likes to do. She does the El Dorado 12-year. It's nice
Great
dark,
rum.
great rum, and pours it on ice cream.
I love it.
She loves it.
I love it.
So
Now, I do want to touch on something there, if you
it's a
don't
great
mind.
sipper too.
It's a terrific
It's
sipper.
a great sipper.
Something, and if I may, would you like to taste a little
Yes,
bit?
let's
Can I
do-
do a little demonstration?